Hello, welcome on this MA course, East meets West, Connections and Convergencies in Cold War and Post-Cold War Europe. My name is Machtel Twijnke. I am a professor of Contemporary Transnational History at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History of the University of Luxembourg. And our guest lecturer today is Dr. Jakub Gałęziowski, who will give a guest lecture titled Developing Terminology, Reshaping Categorizations, Critical Reflections on Theorizing the Concept of Children Born of War with regards to the research in Poland. The subject of his presentation are Polish children born of war. These are individuals whose one parent, usually the mother, was a member of the invaded local community and one, usually the father, was one of the invaders. The existing studies on children born of the Second World War and beyond have almost exclusively related to societies of Western and Northern Europe. The research strategy based on previous studies could not be easily applied to the case study of Dr. Jakub Gałęziowski, which is Poland. It has become necessary to challenge the relevance of terminology and categorizations used so far by scholars lacking empirical data from the region of Central and Eastern Europe. Life stories of participants of the study in Poland did not fit into the categorization scheme currently functioning for the research field of children born of war. Most of these participants would be difficult to place unambiguously in the existing categories. At the same time, they fully or partially meet the criteria of the definition, and there are no grounds, according to this author, to claim that they cannot be considered children born of war. Examples are children whose mothers were Polish female forced laborers in Germany during the war, or children fathered by civil servants employed by Germany during the occupation of Poland. Such outcomes of research carried out in Poland resulted in the necessity to revisit both the terms and definitions used so far in this field of study. And the author even hypothesizes that this may be true for the entire Central and Eastern European region. Jakub Gałęziowski holds a PhD in history from the University of Augsburg and the University of Warsaw. He defended his PhD in 2021. He wrote a dissertation about Polish children born of war. He works at the University of Warsaw, the Faculty of Culture and Arts. He has an interest in oral history and biographical studies. Since 2006, he has cooperated with Karta, which is a Polish non-governmental public organization documenting and popularizing the recent history of Poland and Central Eastern Europe. He conducted more than 200 autobiographical narrative interviews, both in Poland and abroad. Recently, he has been also interested in ethical aspects and the role of emotions in academic research. He is a co-founder of the Polish Oral History Association and was its first president.
Welcome everybody, my name is Jakub Gałęziowski from University of Warsaw, and it is my pleasure to talk a little about my doctoral project, finished already last year. The lecture is entitled Developing Terminology, Reshaping Categorizations, a critical reflection on theorizing the concept of children born of war with regard to the research in Poland. Although we do know a lot about the Second World War, there are still some aspects that have been overlooked by researchers, especially regarding long-term social and psychological consequences of certain phenomena that occurred during the war. There are still uncharted areas in history that require laborious empirical studies, based on basic evidence data to be collected from both archival and oral sources. So far, one of such remaining blind spots have been children born of war, CBOW in general, and children born of war in Central and Eastern Europe in particular. Children born of war are defined as persons whose one parent, usually the mother, was a member of invaded, occupied local community, and the other one, usually the father, was one of the invaders, occupiers. It means enemies. Fathers could be also members of allied forces or peacekeeping troops. Of fundamental importance for the conceptualization of development of children born of war research field was the pioneering War and Children Identity project. The initiative was inspired by research on Norwegian war children, as they call themselves, started in the mid-90s in cooperation with local organization of Norwegian citizens whose fathers were Wehrmacht soldiers. Based on responses from more than 300 questionnaires, it was observed that members of this specific group had suffered a great number of psychological harms from family and society, which resulted in, among other things, later health problems. Other studies also showed that they were subjected to discrimination by the Norwegian state apparatus. However, the lack of access to information about the fathers and mothers, if the children were adopted, was considered by the researchers to be crucial. This fact became an impulse for an activist and researcher, Kai Grieg, to publish a special report on this phenomenon directed. One of his main goals was to create support mechanism for those who were the children or are yet to be born in similar circumstances to enable them to contact their biological parents in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, which states that every child, even if it comes from rape, has the right to know its roots. Within a few months, the first map of this understudied phenomenon was drawn up. For the 20th century alone, the author distinguished 38 different groups of war children, estimating the total number to be around 500,000. In his opinion, the situation was not significantly different in the history. Therefore, the preliminary results allowed the author to confirm that this is a universal and global phenomenon. It's worth mentioning that these first calculations by Grieg are reproduced in almost all text on CBOW, written even a dozen years after the original publication. No one has attempted to estimate such statistic globally again. In the report, a very open approach was taken to include different groups of children in this category. In addition to the children of Wehrmacht soldiers, there were also children of allies born to European women at the end of or after the end of the World War II, as well as children born in other international armed conflicts in civil wars, primarily in Asia and Africa, along with the special case of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The author also noted that this phenomenon includes children born in very different circumstances, but what they have in common is the stigma of being a child of the enemy. This stigma, on the other hand, is very much related to the stigma carried by the mothers of these children, and very often it's a direct result of the type of relationship she had with the child's father. This factor also became the basis for his categorization based on the circumstances of the child's conception. In the first group, the author included children born of consensual relationships with varying degrees of voluntary and coercive between a local woman and an enemy soldier, while in the second, he placed children born as a result of sexualized violence and rape used as a war strategy. In this Norwegian initiative, I see the first attempt to give a common ground to people born in such extremely different circumstances, whose life experiences may have been completely different from each other. The only connecting element, and at the same time the baseline for someone to be considered children born of war, was having parents who came from both sides of the armed conflict, with the military involvement of the child's father. In the late 19th and early 2000s, the research in the field split into two strands corresponding to the categorization proposed by Grieg. After the recognition of sexual violence as a weapon of war, first investigations on children born in such circumstances had been started too. For example, Charlie Carpenter focused on children born as a result of wartime sexual violence, particularly those conceived during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. With time, she extended her interest to other armed conflicts. As part of the Children as Legacies of War project carried out under her leadership, an international team of researchers analyzed the issue of, as they called, war babies in various regions of the world, including Uganda, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Colombia. They also conducted extensive consultations with humanitarian workers regarding practical actions taken in the field with regard to the examined group of children. At the same time, research was being continued in Northern and Western European countries on people born during or just after World War II, whose fathers were Wehrmacht soldiers. Apart from Norway, studies were also conducted in Denmark, the Netherlands, and France. The results of most of them were presented in the book Children of World War II, The Hidden Enemy Legacy. In the book, issues of terminology had been raised by Ebba Drolshagen, a journalist and historian not associated with the academy. Starting with an explanation of the meaning of the term Christkinder, the author introduced the topic of German Besatzungskinder for the first time in such a context. Drolshagen proposed also that all children of Wehrmacht soldiers in various countries be covered by one term and introduced and popularized the name Wehrmachtskinder, thus creating a separate group of children born of war. It's worth noting that for Drolshagen this subject also had a personal dimension, as she is the daughter of a German doctor and Norwegian women. Similarly, other authors and activists from Denmark, Holland, and Belgium. The awareness of the existence of such circumstances is, in my opinion, important because it allows us to see how the research field of CBOW was shaped in Europe and how much the representatives of the research groups themselves contributed to this process as co-authors of research tools, authors of autobiographies, and finally activists in organizations for Wehrmacht children. With time, the activism of some of them, thanks to the professionalization of their activities, made them researchers of their own group. Also, the associations founded in Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, France, Finland, and Belgium played a key role in the process, especially in consolidating the community and constructing its coherent identity, as well as in the struggle for its proper place in national narratives about the Second World War. The creation of international organization Born of War International Network, which brings together local associations, has also allowed them to act on a transnational level. Many of their activities caught the attention of journalists and artists, and subsequent events caused media storms, thus included their experiences in the public discourse. Despite attempts to consolidate the whole research field, the two environments of researchers, for example, it means studying the fate of children born as a result of sexual violence and those whose parents met in their other circumstances, operated independently. It was not until 2006, at an international meeting in Cologne, attended by researchers and practitioners dealing with some of these groups of children, that an attempt was made to consolidate the two fields of research into one. As Ingrid Mochman wrote, it was agreed that the two categories should be named and treated equally, which was not without resistance, especially from those who dealt with the sexual violence. In their opinion, the children born as a result of organized genocide rape require special protection and should not be compared with others. Mochman argued instead that the results of various studies proved that children born from more or less voluntary relationships experience similar negative consequences, resulting from their bad background as children born of sexual violence. Starting with this event in Cologne, a group of researchers sought to create one research field by referring to the experiences of stigma and discrimination common to all children born of war, creating a vulnerable group. At the Cologne meeting, beside the agreement on terminology, Mochman proposed her categorization on children born of war, which went across the division made by Kai Grieg, blurring the distinction between children conceived in different circumstances. They now fell into three separate categories: children of enemy soldiers, children of occupying forces, perceived as enemies or friends depending on the situation, and children of peacekeeping troops. A separate group was formed by the so-called child soldiers. In this way, the military component in relations between CBOW parents was also confirmed and perpetuated, distinguishing this category of children from other children also affected by the war. Turning to issues of terminology, definitions, and categorizations, it's important to note that in the early years of the development of the research field, both branches used the same, the terms war children or alternatively war babies. In the case of Greek, he borrowed the term krigsbarn, war children, used in Norway. The term children born of war was first used by Carpenter in 2005 and referred exclusively to children born as a result of wartime rape. A year later, at the aforementioned conference in Cologne, the name was adopted not without controversy for all those born of war regardless of the circumstances of conception. In addition to this one general term, other already mentioned terms have also been used since the early 2000s. Wehrmacht children, occupation children, as well as children of World War II and beyond. Reference was also made to two categorizations, that of Greek based on the circumstances of the children's conception, and four groups according to Mochman. In order to make the phenomenon more scientific, two analytical models were also put into use. Mochman's model points out to context, historical, geographical, religious, cultural, and military, and thematically organized factors, biomedical, psychological, social and economic, legal and political, within which and through which the lives of and development of children born of war could be experienced negatively. The second model, introduced by psychologists from Leipzig, emphasizes the impact of diverse factors on psychological stress related to being children born of war: stigma and discrimination, child maltreatment, identity development. Both models, compared in the book by Sabine Lee, demonstrate two different approaches to the same topic, while seeking to establish a uniform interpretative framework applicable to all children. In their most recent publication on children born of war, Lee, together with Heidi Glesmer, point out the necessity to continue the discussion on the terms used within the changing reality, with more frequent civil wars, confirming the adequacy of the theoretical apparatus in use in this field of study. In aside from Regina Mulhauser's research on intimate relations between German occupiers and local women, as well as on sexual violence in the Eastern Nazi-occupied territories, and Maren Ruger's in relation to occupied Poland, only the EU-funded project Children Born of War, Past, Present and Future intended to fill the gap on Central Eastern Europe, but the objective has been only partially achieved. So far, the study has already been completed only for Poland. In Lithuania, the research was terminated before it reached its end phase. In the Czech Republic, the focal point of the study were children from mixed Czech-German marriages, including those from pre-war period. In Latvia, the relevant research focused mainly on the relationships between Latvian women and German occupiers, and to a lesser extent on Latvian CBOW. Apart from studies focusing above-mentioned countries from Central Eastern Europe, there are still regions where research on these topics has not yet been undertaken at all. Research findings from the sub-project on Polish children born of war seemed to not fit to the functioning discourse on children born of World War II, and thus the chapter pertaining to Polish children born of war was not included to the final publication. As a result, in the book summarizing work carried out within the whole project, the conceptual framework applied to European CBOW was reconfirmed and reiterated. As already mentioned, Polish children born of war have never been studied thoroughly except the research by Maren Ruger exploring intimate relationships between Polish women and German occupiers. For this reason, as the existing study on children born of Second World War and beyond have almost exclusively related to societies of Western and Northern Europe, the research strategy consisting in using previous studies could not be easily applied in Poland. Instead, it has become necessary to challenge the relevance of categories and theoretical models used by previous scholars, lacking empirical data from the vast geographical area of Central and Eastern Europe. The method based on participatory research approach that have been successfully used in other countries like Norway, Denmark, Germany and Austria would not be applied in this case. Data gathering from both historical sources as well as autobiographical narrative interviews, not to mention more extensive quantitative surveys, proved challenging. In Poland, data on this group of children has never been systematically collected, hence there are no archival records such as those in the above-mentioned countries. Polish children of war have never been identified as a separate category of people particularly affected by the war, the fact that is manifested in the lack of formal groups or associations in which such persons would meet. They are also absent in organizations representing Polish children that were the war victims. Participants in this study do not regard themselves as war victims, which distinguishes them from their Western counterparts, as described in the relevant literature, who tend to be very conscious of their stages in the society and the collective memory about the Second World War and its consequences. In case of Polish children of war, it's possible to hypothesize that most do not even know that they are children of war because they are not aware of their true origin. The consequence for this study was that it has not been possible to use the databases and contact details provided by relevant associations or institutions dedicated to that groups of people and had been done in other earlier studies on CBOW. However, the research in Poland has eventually yielded an extraordinary body of empirical evidence, retrieved written documents and autobiographical narrative interviews with people who were born of war. This included not only two subgroups listed in preliminary title of the sub-project, Children of German and Soviet Occupiers, but also unexpected research participants conceived in different war and post-war scenarios and had previously not been considered. Such outcomes of research carried out in Poland resulted in the necessity to revisit both the terms and definitions used so far in this field of study. The study also offers a different perspective of children of war, not as a vulnerable population, which may be an imposed label, but using the concept of layers of vulnerability. It has clearly demonstrated that something that in one situation constitutes someone's vulnerability, in other contexts does not cause it at all. Thus, the concept developed by Florencja Luna perfectly fits the purpose of description in case of the group of Polish CBOW and hypothetically the CBOW in general. In all the countries where research has been carried out to date, the CBOW had been shrouded in silence. In Poland, such silence operates on additional levels and all dimensions of life, personal, family-related, and social. In family stories, including family secrets, and in the national master narrative about the Second World War and its aftermath, there was no place for the children of war nor their mothers, who were perceived neither as victims nor as collaborators, both by society and the state. The shame associated with the conception circumstances, which however did not turn into hostility towards these women, but rather manifested itself in a desire to forget about their existence, sets the pattern of the fate of the CBOW in post-war Poland. They proved to be the proverbial elephant in the room, known to everyone but jointly obliterated, a problem that is collaboratively ignored. This well-known idiom, developed theoretically by Eviatar Zerubabel and employed as an analytical tool in his work on the influence of taboo on processes occurring in private, family, social and public lives, with reference to Holocaust survivors, seems also accurate in relation to the Polish CBOW. According to the American sociologist, having a specific identity shapes not merely one's personal life and affects the person's family and social relations, but is also connected with a denial process at work in the public sphere. Furthermore, the experiences of Holocaust survivors raised the issue of the second generation within the studied population, the children of the children born of war, the subject so far not included in the research constituting this field of study. As already mentioned, initially the doctoral project was to focus on two subgroups of Polish CBOW, children fathered by German and Soviet occupiers. However, conversations with persons who responded to the call for participants and told me their life stories made me abandon the usual patterns. Children born through contacts with German soldiers, mainly of consensual relations, and children of Soviet soldiers conceived as a result of rape. For example, two women in the study were born in the Third Reich not long before the war ended. Their mothers were Poles, forced laborers, even though in both cases it was indicated that they went to Germany voluntarily, encouraged by the fathers of the children, Wehrmacht soldiers. After delivery, both babies were left in Germany by their mothers and from 1945 lived in orphanages in Bavaria under the American occupation. Then the girls were forcibly brought to Poland by the Polish communist authorities and the Polish Red Cross. In one case, the mother took her daughter back under her care, while the other girl, after a brief stay in a transitory care facility managed by Polish Red Cross, was adopted by a Polish couple. Both these participants experienced their specific war legacy in a dramatic, although different ways. Iwona Toruńska was troubled by the fact that she was an illegitimate child by her mother's emotional coldness. Motherhood might have radically changed the participant's mother's life prospects, where Renata Juras struggled with the feeling of emptiness after the loss of her mother, and throughout her adult life asked herself why her mother had never tried to find her. In both cases, the mothers appeared to be the foregrounded figures, while the German fathers were rather ignored, except for the fear that they may have been Nazi. In two other cases from the study, German fathers were not Wehrmacht soldiers, but civilians, one being an administrator of an estate in Reichsgau, Warthegau, and other a criminal prisoner of a concentration camp who became capo and then a camp guard. Soviet fathers included persons involved in consensual relationships and not only rapists. One of them was a Red Army soldier who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp located in an area now being part of northern Poland. Following his escape, he was hiding in woods for almost 2 years and only survived due to the assistance of several families from the nearby villages, including a widow with 3 children. A love relationship between her and the Soviet escapee was initially not accepted by the local community. Their daughter, Bożena Sroka, born in 1947, was called a Soviet brat, like children born of wartime rapes. Even though her parents lived together, loved each other, and finally married, after several years and with support from the local parish priest. However, much time had to pass before this binational family was fully accepted by the neighbors. Among my interviewees, there was also Janusz Mayevsky, a man born to a Polish former female forced laborer whose father was a black American soldier. In 1949, as a 3-year-old boy, he was relocated or repatriated from the British occupation zone in Germany together with other Polish children to Szczecin in west-north Poland, and then placed in a provincial orphanage, where he stayed until he came of age. There he was stigmatized but not subject to discrimination, although on various occasions he was forced to play the role of a mascot. Nowadays, he lives in the United States, where he feels that his biracial parentage does not make him so conspicuous. Each of the research participants presented above was born of war, and thus considered a children born of war. Archival documents confirmed numerous similar cases, especially involving children born in Germany, and then repatriated as stolen children. Expanding the research field to include previously unexplored regions and societies, containing specific new experiences and narratives, naturally raises new questions. The situation and living conditions in the Central and Eastern Europe during the war and under the occupation, involving 2 aggressors, produced new scenarios for intimate relationships between the occupiers and the occupied, as well as previously unknown circumstances enabling the conception of children born of war. Ebba Drolshagen has already noted that the German occupation structure was much more extensive and diverse in this territory. Regina Mühlhauser and Maren Rüger have both highlighted the disproportionately larger presence of various Nazi paramilitary and police formations of various nationalities, as well as the existence of sizable civilian administrative apparatus. The latter provided the basis for including the context of forced labor and the role of civilian occupiers in the definition of children born of war. Previously, these factors had been overlooked because no research on CBOW has been conducted in this part of Europe and on the experiences specific to societies living there in connection with children born of war. Therefore, scholars have simply failed to recognize it as a research problem. This study confirmed that observations made by the researchers mentioned above and identified 4 different groups of Polish CBOW. First, children born to Polish female citizens and fathered by representatives of German occupation forces, both military and civilian. Second, children born to Polish female citizens and fathered by Red Army soldiers and members of Soviet paramilitary formations. Third, children born to Polish female citizens and fathered by prisoners of war of various nationalities. And fourth, children born to Polish female forced laborers, female concentration camp inmates, and female DPs, fathered both by German citizens, soldiers, officials, camp guards, and employers, and Allied soldiers after 45. As mentioned above, fathers of the Polish CBOW included both members of the occupation forces, military, paramilitary, and civilian, and soldiers. Active, for example, the Allied soldiers, and captives, prisoners of war who often later become forced laborers. Such understanding challenges the prevalent assumption that the condition for identifying someone as a CBOW was having a foreign soldier father. This approach stems from the changing conditions of the 20th century war operations and the variety of courses wars took in the different regions. Warfare, the domain of the military, was accompanied by occupation activities in the conquered areas, introducing a complex administrative apparatus of the occupiers, represented mainly by the paramilitary forces, police, and civilian operatives who arrived in the area under occupation in order to implement the aggressor's policy among the invaded population. One of the tools of the Nazi policy of terror was forced labor, supervised by occupying officials. Moreover, during the Second World War, different subjugated populations were subject to significantly different treatment, resulting from the Nazi racial policy. All these factors were at play in occupied Poland, and the claim that Polish children fathered by enemy soldiers were particularly stigmatized, or that living conditions were more dire than those of other Polish children fathered by members of the SS, the Nazi police, or civilian administration staff, is untenable. The records of court proceedings retrieved by Maren Rüger related to the juridical establishment of fatherhood and alimonies demonstrate that within the area of occupied Poland, all above-mentioned paternity scenarios were actually taking place, and that despite formal obstacles, in many cases, German men, both members of the military and civilian forces, were obliged to pay alimony. In this context, the situation of children born in the Third Reich to Polish forced laborers' mothers was particularly difficult, as they were automatically separated from their mothers in the fact that they were fathered by a German was confirmed, and were later to be Germanized. The key factor in the case of paternity was father's origin rather than his profession, position, or social status. Finally, there is also no reason to treat as separate the fate of children fathered by the Allied forces and born to German or Austrian mothers, so-called occupation children, or Besatzungskinder, and the persons whose mothers were female forced laborers or DPs of a different nationality. Actually, the first group is considered to be CBOW, while the second is not. Using appropriate terminology is critical in every research. That is why one of the earliest and most general descriptions of this specific group provided by Kai Greek and mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture should be reminded. According to him, children born of war are individuals whose one parent, usually the mother, was a member of the invaded occupied local community, the other parent, usually the father, being one of the invaders or occupiers. The empirical evidence found in the course of this study justified the inclusion in the definition children who were born in situations marked by warfare, occupation, forced labor, and captivity, whose parents belonged to two enemy sides, as well as children who had never been born because they would be CBOW. Among them, some were conceived through sexual violence, motivated and perpetuated by a complex mix of individual and collective, premeditated and circumstantial reasons, and some were conceived as a result of sexual relationships with varying degree of consent. The circumstances of war and occupation make it difficult to precisely define the nature of individual relationships. Due to terminological and linguistic limitations in my study and it this lecture, the phrase children born of war is used only with reference to people who were indeed born, while the phrase children conceived of war encompasses also preborn as well as stillborn children and children who died at birth. The CBOW acronym, like in other publications in the field, refers to all children conceived of war. It's also necessary for the purpose of clarification to refer to two terms used in relevant literature: Wehrmacht children, Wehrmachtskinder, and occupation children, Besatzungskinder, and consider them into the Polish context. Using the first term in relation to part of the Polish CBOW is legitimate, but the term children of German occupiers would be much more adequate due to the complex structure of the Nazi occupation apparatus at work in the Polish territory. The name Besatzungskinder usually referred to children born to German and Austrian women and fathered by the Allied soldiers who were perceived as occupiers. However, this term should not be applied to children born on the territory of the former Third Reich to force female laborers of various nationalities and DPs, in favor of a more neutral term such as children of Allied soldiers. In such cases, although there was no hostility on both sides, there is still the factor of the foreign soldier interacting with the local population, which includes women of other nationalities temporarily residing in the given area. Polish children born of war have much more complicated identity background than the one usually described in the available literature on children born of war in the other European countries. The Polish CBOW are persons born to Polish mothers or the so-called autochtons, native women belonging to the one of many ethnic and national minorities, and raised in the post-war Poland. They could have been born on the Polish territory within the interwar borders, either in the lands incorporated into the Polish state after the Second World War and outside Poland. Their fathers could be members of the German military forces, Wehrmacht soldiers, and civil occupiers, members of the Nazi paramilitary formations and police, German guards of concentration camps, the staff of German industrial companies, and private land owners who employed forced laborers. Western allies who had been fighting on the territory of the Third Reich and stayed in the occupation zones after the ceasefire, American, British, and French soldiers, as well as immigrants from their colonies. And finally, soldiers of the Red Army and other Soviet paramilitary formations. It's also noteworthy that most of military and paramilitary formations, but principally the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, included many nationalities. Besides the already mentioned ethnic, social, and cultural differences with regard to both women and men, and consequently children, it's useful to point out other differences which can be divided into two categories. The first category includes geopolitical factors that are somehow external and independent of the participants of Polish occupation scene, while the second involves factors connected with the situations within the state and the society. In this study, all groups of Polish children born of war were classified according to the origin and status of their fathers, with the exception of children of Polish female forced laborers and DPs, where the categorizing element was the mothers impregnated by men of various nationalities. This last group has so far been absent from research on children born of war. The inclusion of children of forced laborers and DPs into the CBOW category, although not a completely new idea, has not yet received sufficient attention within the children CBOW research field. The reason for this omission may be the lack of research on the Central and Eastern European CBOW, the group most affected by their particular circumstances. Thus, my study may hopefully pave way towards new areas for research and perhaps inspire scholars to explore the topics stemming from it, as well as to critically assess the existing assumptions. However, while in other countries the existence of children born to former forced laborers may be considered as yet another dimension of the children born of war phenomenon, in Poland the context of forced labor is of the fundamental importance. It does not constitute a homogeneous issue, but rather presents many intervening threads, layers, and context of which the researchers must be well aware. Three layers of interplay between the CBOW research field and the context of forced labor become evident in the course of this research. The first layer involves the children of Polish women and German men born either in the territories incorporated into the Third Reich or within the occupied Polish territory and taken from their mothers for Germanization. Although they belonged to the different group of CBOW, children of the German occupiers, they were also part of the group of stolen children, uprooted from their natural environment, usually followed by a short stay in one of the transitory centers. They were sent for adoption into the Third Reich. The second layer involves several groups of children, of the offspring of Polish female forced laborers and children of female concentration camps, prisoners conceived with German men and born in the Third Reich, as well as the children conceived with the Allied soldiers or foreign prisoners of war and born after the war's end by the female DPs. Simultaneously, all these groups constituted larger categories: children of female forced laborers, children of female prisoners, or children of female DPs. The third layer refers to children born to former forced laborers slaves by Soviet soldiers on their way back from Germany to Poland, especially during so-called wild repatriation. Although information retrieved from documents related to the organizations of assistance for raped women clearly indicates that such rapes did take place, the group has been entirely neglected in the narratives of Second World War in Poland and in the Polish historiography. Children in the first two layers had much in common. Their mothers were Polish citizens and their fathers were foreigners, not only soldiers of various formations and rank, but also officials and representatives of the Nazi power. In case of children fathered by German men, the racial factor played a decisive role, expressed in the forced Germanization. Some of them were taken away from their mothers at birth, while others were not allowed to be born at all. Some of those who survived as unaccompanied children passed into the care of UNRWA. At the same point, the Polish state claimed all Polish children that remaining in the occupation zones, triggering the already mentioned revindication and repatriation campaign. Obviously, the children born in the former Third Reich could hardly be said to be returning home or repatriated. However, as part of the propaganda, the Polish authorities obfuscated the diversity of the children's parentage. After their arrival, their fates also took different courses. Only some of the children were placed with foster families, others were left to live in institutional care facilities until they reached adulthood. Most of the little repatriates were not returned to their biological families as the government had declared. The existence of such group of children was intentionally obfuscated, even thought people responsible for their repatriation, both in the occupation zones, in Germany, in Austria, and in Poland, must have been aware of the children's true parentage, which also does not necessarily mean that the children themselves were unaware of it. They become the proverbial elephant in the room. Summing up the issues related to terminology, I think it's crucial to include both local and international perspectives in research. This requires not only a critical approach to existing findings, but also a readiness to make changes while abandoning certain postulates that preclude dialogue between researchers dealing with different aspects of the children born of war experience. The term children born of war could be confirmed as applicable to all children born of war, regardless of the circumstances of conception. It could be a kind of umbrella term for all CBOW groups and subgroups. It should be inclusive, in which different types of fates are accommodated but not equated. For example, only in relation to World War II, recognizing that being a child conceived as a result of Soviet rape is completely incomparable to being a child from a white American soldier's intimate relations with a British woman could avoid the tensions of competition of suffering. Concentrating research within particular groups and subgroups on the one hand, and attempting comparative studies on a smaller scale on the other, could contribute much to the research field as a whole. In order to organize this vast and very diverse field of research, it would be helpful, in my opinion, to use a schema in the form of sets like math sets, where the broadest frame would be war children, that is, all those children who have been affected in any way because of life during armed conflict and occupation. It would include CBOW as a completely autonomous set that includes groups of children born in various armed conflicts and post-conflict situations around the world, regardless of the circumstances of conception, while fulfilling the baseline conditions necessary to be considered CBOW. Particular groups of CBOW would belong to distinct sets that may be in various relationships with others, by disjoint, intersect, or include, thus forming smaller or larger units that can then be subjected to detailed analysis. The basis for qualification would be a definition, formulated in such a general and open way that it would allow the inclusion of groups not yet included, but based on the unambiguous criteria. In my opinion, such a definition, which has been slightly corrected and supplemented over time, has functioned almost from the very beginning of research on the CBOW and was mentioned by Grieg in his report. However, he included only soldiers' fathers, military personnel, both as participants in the conflict and as representatives of peacekeeping forces, but also in the context of civil wars. With time, the list was supplemented with child soldiers and finally with non-military occupation personnel, who are variously referred to as a service personnel or paramilitary officers, rebel, or other persons directly participating in hostilities. However, since Lee and Mochman did not specify who exactly they had in mind, the findings of Regina Mulhauser and Maren Ruger may serve as an explanation. The latter pointed to the presence of paramilitary and non-military occupation apparatus on Polish soil, and for this reason consistently used the generic term German occupiers in the context of intimate relations with Polish women, which, as I wrote, led her to apply to the term occupation children to children conceived by them. Changes in the definition were inevitable due to the inclusion of more groups of children born in armed conflict zones. This process can be considered open-ended and developing. Since new conflict situations widened the research field to include new groups of CBOW, I believe that the research into past conflicts, especially the unexplored aspects, should also provide such a possibility. In my opinion, the criterion of origin, parents of both sides of the front line, is the only one that can determine belonging to the CBOW category. In my research, I decided to use two terms aware of their shortcomings. I consider the abbreviation CBOW optimal with an adjective indicating the origin, referring, however, to the nationality of the mothers, and an additional specification of who the father of a given child was. The Polish translation of the term is dzieci urodzone z powodu wojny. Again, I prefer to adjective Polish than in Poland. While in most countries this formulation of local CBOW could be used interchangeably, in this particular case it's not. Not all Polish CBOW were born in Poland. Some of them were born in the Third Reich, when their mothers were forced to work for the aggressor, or after the war, when these territories were occupied by allies. Only such a formula with an additional specification of paternity, due to the heterogeneity of the group, is, in my opinion, able to precisely define who I really meant. Thus, depending on the context, names such as children of German occupiers or children born as a result of rape by Red Army soldiers, in all variants they reflect the specificity of these groups, as well as other groups such as children of American soldiers and Polish former forced laborers or Polish DPs. The necessity to use these descriptive names results not only from the lack of possibility of precise and catchy translation of the term children born of war into Polish, but also from the theoretical and ethical premises, which I try to outline above, as well as from caution when translating foreign concepts into the local ground. In this lecture, I wanted to show how important it is to be careful and open to new sources and perspectives when studying global phenomena in local circumstances. The existence of CBOW in the Central and Eastern Europe should result in a discussion on optimizing the tools of description and research methods in such a way as to fully capture the entire CBOW phenomenon in its local characteristics. But this example can be easily translated into other topics too. Thank you very much.